Mechanics Institute. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our program for the book launch of Orphic Paris with author Henri Cole in conversation with Professor Mark Calkins. We're very pleased that we're co-sponsoring this event with City Lights Bookstore and Publishers, and very pleased to welcome Peter Maravellis, Program Director of City Lights, and Cassie Dugan, who are here with us and who will be selling books after our program. Now, before we begin, I'd like to find out how many of you are new to the Mechanics Institute. Who's never been here before? Welcome. Bienvenue au Mechanics Institute. And we hope that this will be one of many visits here. First of all, I'd like to invite you to come back on a Wednesday at noontime and take the free tour of the Mechanics Institute and our incredible library, which is on the second and third floors. Also, you'll see our International Chess Club, which is right down the hallway. And also, you'll get an introduction to our history. Of course, we were founded in 1854, so we have a long, exciting history here in the city of San Francisco. Also, under one roof, in this incredible building, here at 57 Post Street, we have author programs on a weekly basis, our Cinema Lit film series on Friday night. The library offers workshops on writing, writers support groups, book clubs. Mark is doing his incredible Proust group, and also the chess club with its tournaments, lectures, chess for women, children, all ages and all backgrounds. So we hope that you'll come, take the tour, and then become a member and become part of our incredible, vital cultural community here. So tonight is very special. We're very pleased to welcome Henri Cole here for the first time. Orphic Paris is a poet's view of his favorite city. It is part diary, memoir, and essay. Henri is a world citizen. He was born in Fukuoka, Japan, and also raised in Virginia, and travels often to Paris. He received his BA from the College of William and Mary in '78, an MA from the University of Wisconsin, and an MFA from Columbia University. His volumes of poetry include Nothing to Declare, poems, Pierce the Skin, selected poems, Blackbird and Wolf, the 2008 recipient of Lenore Marshall Poetry Prize, and Middle Earth, which received the 2004 Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award. He is the recipient of fellowships from the Camargo Foundation in Cassis, France, the Ingram Merrill Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. He currently teaches in the Department of Literature at Claremont McKenna College. And Professor Mark Calkins is the lecturer faculty in the Department of Comparative and World Literature at the College of Liberal and Creative Arts at San Francisco State University. And as I mentioned before, he is the leader of our Proust group here at the Mechanics Institute, which is now in its 12th year. So please welcome Henri Cole and Professor Mark Calkins.
Good evening, and welcome to
Thank
San
you.
Francisco. Tonight, as a Proustian, I'm bringing a lot of Proustian baggage, in a sense, with me tonight. I wonder if I'd like to talk about bees tonight. You talk about bees in Orphic Paris. I'd like to talk about Orpheus a little bit. Fables, perhaps. You mentioned La Fontaine. I teach La Fontaine in a class at State. If we get to it, maybe the relationship between the photography in Orphic Paris and the word. And of course, I want you to read some excerpts from Orphic Paris. So one of the first things you say about bees is the hives in the Jardin de Luxembourg. And you describe them as looking like Victorian houses. I thought, San Francisco, Victorian houses. Right. So welcome to San Francisco. There are many presences, I thought, in Orphic Paris. There's some explicit presences, for example, your family, your intimate friendships, many poets you mention, I think most notably Baudelaire, Rilke, Bishop, and Plath, as well as visual artists. I think there's also, I found some implicit presences, like Roland Barthes. There's a real warmth in Orphic Paris, a generosity and intimacy that I associate with some of the late Barthes. I thought of W.G. Sebald and his use of text and pictures. And I also had the sense that there were some Proustian topoi in this book. You mention that one of your first memories is dunking a croissant in your grandmother's café au lait. You want to say anything more about that memory?
No, I mean, it was in Marseille. I was a little boy, and my parents were visiting from a military base to my mother's parents. And amazingly, I have a film of that time, that my father was a real kind of photography nut. So he filmed a lot of these things. So I have video of actually some of the images in the book are stills from the videos that my father took.
Oh, very interesting. So I'm going to go off plan. I'm very interested in the fact that some of the images in the book are from family videos. That's amazing. How did you come about going through that material and deciding to include it?
Well, my sister some years ago, my sister Patricia, some years ago took all these family videos and she made, DVDs of them, I guess is what they are. So I had them, I could just watch them on my laptop. And I went through them all. When I was making the book, as you know, there are 100 images in the book, and about 80 of them are from my little BlackBerry telephone. And some are by a friend, Susan Unterberg, and then the others are stills from these videos that my father made.
Was there a principle of selection, what images you decided to include?
No. The actual conception of the book was meant to, though I'm flattered by your mentioning Sebald and Proust, I don't really think my name should be in the same sentence with them, but I was born in Japan, and there are these forms in Japanese literature. One is called a haipun, and one is called a zuitsu. And
Are those poetic forms?
Yes. Well, the haipun is a diary form in which you make an entry in a diary and you write down to a lyric moment of a haiku or a tanka. So my strategy in the book was to use the photographs as the sort of lyric moment, and the prose diary to be the diary part that would be in the Japanese form. In the zuitsu, it's a loosely connected group of personal essays, very often made out of fragments, and very often they deal with time and the passing of the seasons, and so those were sort of the models that were more uppermost in my mind. There were these Eastern models, which I was applying to the setting of Paris.
Did you begin with the photographs and then write from there?
The photographs, I would say no. I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of BlackBerry photographs of Paris, but it's possible some of the memory. Well, there is one moment where I amazingly have a video or a photograph of my first ride on a boat on the Seine,
yes.
and that's in the book. That's probably the only occasion where I actually wrote to the image. But I like the counterpoint between the images and some of this was on the New Yorker's literary blog, the Page Turner, and when you were putting something on on a literary blog on the internet. They were really quite splendid color photographs. But for the purposes of the book, we made the conscious decision to make them more documentary-like and to sort of sublimate them and push the text forward. So they have a whole different relationship in a way. They're not pretty in the same way. They're kind of more handsome.
And they're relatively small.
And they're very small.
Yeah.
And some of them are, it's hard to make out what's in them. But unlike with the Sebald model, I was certainly aware of the Sebald model. I think my favorite book of his, I read all the books, a long time ago when they came out. Well, actually, I met him once in Berlin, and I had the privilege of sitting across from him at a lunch table, and he was a very, very lovely gentleman. And I had already, read all of his books, but we had very little to say to each other. We were both so deferential to each other, and then he was dead. But
Have you read his poetry?
I have read his poetry. In fact, I had the privilege of publishing a little bit of it in the New Republic when I was the poetry editor there. They were the posthumous poems that were hanging around. But the book that I really loved was The Immigrants, which also, I know you had mentioned the Rings of Saturn in our communication, but both books use this, this image as a counterpoint.
Right.
I think in his case...
Could you actually say a little more about the image as counterpoint, as you see that happening in Sebald?
Well, as I understand it, in his book, or in his books, he photocopied his images 100 times to make them, to push them as far away, to make them unrecognizable almost. And they're just there. And they do seem to have an archival sense. I don't think mine are archival. Mine are sort of prettier. And they're not illustrations, but I think they're meant to be a counterpoint emotionally in some way. I think they're. They work differently in different places. I think. The family narrative is an important one to me in the book, and so those family images are important, and yet I just wanted that to be a kind of backdrop to the grown-up adult narrative.
I think you were successful at that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So you mentioned, there is a part, as I mentioned, you describe the hives in the Jardin de Luxembourg.
Yes.
And then later on, you have a little bit more extended development about bees and about Sylvia Plath's bee poems, the bee sequence. For those who don't know, the bee, and Horace in Odes came up with this metaphor of a poet is like a bee that goes from different flowers to flowers and takes something from this flower, takes something from this flower, but the poet ultimately goes back and makes his or her own honey, so to speak, although has taken from...
The bee takes something rough,
yeah,
from the flowers and then refines it into gold.
And for Horace and for Petrarch elaborates this metaphor, as does Montaigne, that those flowers that the bee sucks from are actually like other authors. And this metaphor in the Renaissance, in the querelle des anciens et des modernes, should poets follow ancient models like Homer and Virgil, which have such prestige, or should the modern European poet do something that's modern and true to something contemporary? So that model of the apiarian model is, you can take a little bit from ancient authors, take a little bit of nectar from various ancient authors, but make it yourself. So there's a kind of it's kind of an intertextual metaphor, I think.
That's interesting.
So you talk about a lot of poets, and you cite their poetry, and I wondered if there's the relationship of you as and you identify yourself, and I hope you can read as a kind of what you do is kind of like what a bee does, but in particular in terms of relation to sucking the nectar of other poets. And
well, I don't think of the bees that way, actually. I mean, I think of the bees in relation to the writing process in the sense that the bees are collecting something raw, as poets take human experience, which is raw, and then they assemble it into language, poetry being the highest art form of controlled language. And the bees likewise, take the pollen and the stuff of the flowers. I think of the flowers more as feelings than as individual. There's a lot of writing about flowers in the book. A whole bunch of writing about flowers. And I think when I see flowers, I see them as stand-in for feelings, you might say. So you could say the bees take the feelings, and then, but I do admit there is something parasitic about the life of the writer, and who feeds off.
I would never characterize what a bee does as parasitic to the flower, but yeah. So
should I read something about the bees?
Yeah.
There's this little passage. It's very strange for me to read a paragraph here and read a paragraph there in the book, because the way I conceived of the book in a way was for it to proceed by digression, and that the digressions are not pointless, but they're meant to seem a little pointless. But then in the end, the book has a kind of collage effect, so that when you get to the end, the parts of it come together. There are about 8 or 10 different. We mentioned the little narrative of my mother's French family from Marseille. And then there's the little narrative of my life in Paris, and the people that I meet. There are two people that figure in the book very eminently for me. One of them is my 92-year-old translator, Claire Malraux, who was a wonderful poet and a translator of from Dickinson to Stevens to Bishop, etc. And then there's this really lovely man I was fortunate to meet named James Lord, who was a friend of artists and a biographer of artists. He wrote, actually there's a film that's just come out called, what is it called? Final Time? Final Time, it's just come out, and it stars this Armie Hammer from the, what was that, Call Me By Your Name film. And Armie plays James Lord, and he's sitting for Giacometti, and he goes for 17 or 18.
Could you say something? I mean, it's lovely what you write about James Lord. Could you identify him a little bit for our?
Sure. Well, he's now dead. He died about 10, 11 years ago. And but he arrived in Paris. He had grown up in Connecticut. He was sort of a Wesleyan dropout. And he arrived in Paris as a soldier, a slightly limping soldier, at the door of Picasso in Paris. And Picasso took him in and befriended him. And he has a magnificent book called Picasso and Dora, which is I think it's a kind of fictionalized account of his relationship with them. But he also has, he came to know Balthus and Giacometti and all these, early painters that were working in Paris. And he wrote about them all in these kind of magnificent books, which are probably all out of print now, but you can get them very cheap on Amazon. And he befriended me, or I befriended him. I was given a connection to him through my editor, and James sort of took me into his life over this year that I was there. And, we spent a lot of time talking about paintings. And in his living room, he lived, I've forgotten the name of the street that he lived on now, Rue des Beaux-Arts. In his living room, he would always sit on the sofa, and I would sit on a adjacent seat, and he would drink a Coca-Cola, and I would have a scotch. And behind him hung this amazing portrait of him by Giacometti. So this film that's just come out is about these he wrote a book called Sitting for Giacometti or something. It's a tiny little book about, he must have rushed home and, kept a complex, elaborate narrative notebook of all the conversations, and all of this was, it's used as the screenplay really for this film. So I recommend it to you if you want to get a little taste of it. Certainly, I think James would have been very happy to be, to have Armie Hammer play him in the film. But James was, a handsome man too. He died in his 80s. There's a whole episode of the book written about him. And after he died, I received a letter, amazingly, from him. And it took about 12 days for the letter to reach me. And, he died, I think, just of a heart attack. But the letter was just an update, and included in the letter was, I always brought him flowers whenever we had supper. And he made a Matisse-like colored pencil drawing of these flowers and said, "You gave me real flowers, and all I can give you are these, hand-drawn flowers." And he inserted, and amazingly, it arrived after he was dead, after the New York Times had run an obituary of him. So one of the 17 parts of the book is a portrait of him.
You want to read some of that? We've been digressing a little bit. You were going to read about bees, but...
Where is that? Do you know? I don't even
105,
remember.
106?
I don't know where anything is in the book, I have to say. Also, I'm about to turn 62 years old, and I have 9 books of poetry, but I have never published prose, and I feel a little like an imposter reading prose for that reason. But...
Well, I had the sense sometimes that this was a lovely prose poem.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very nice. It was certainly, it certainly was hard to write. Prose is just so hard to write because there's so many more words. They're just,
wait, I have to hear about that. Tell me about
Oh,
prose having so many more words.
Well,
Or
the way the book is actually conceived is like a lyric poem, which is in a lyric poem you take uncommon, disparate things and push them together, and you try and create, something fresh, something new. You try to move towards some fresh knowledge of some sort, and that's the way this is done. I mean, there's not a lot of exposition connecting anything. Yeah. There's not a through narrative. In a way, it's just a book about a conversation with myself about 15 different things that I hope will be, interesting. Bees are one of them. Flowers are one of them. My family is one of them. Loneliness and solitude are one of them. Homosexuality is one of them. There are, maybe a dozen things. You might think of the book as like a carpet through which there are, 12 different colored stripes, and those stripes all together make the carpet. That's what I wanted, how I wanted it to work.
I think I see that. Yeah. So given that you feel uncomfortable taking these passages out of context.
Should I just read the je t'aime thing, the part, the j'aime, and then, how are we doing on time?
We've got
Feels
about
like
10 more minutes.
5 hours.
We've got about 10 minutes before we open for questions.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sorry it's felt like 5 hours.
No, that's okay. So, What
Yeah.
do I do next?
Do you want to start reading from on page 164?
Okay.
I think Paris is City of the Beloved. We talked about that.
The last passage of the book is a kind of ecstatic praise poem, you might say, for Paris. I mean, not a praise poem, praise passage. It's not a poem at all. This picture, my mother, was a passport photo.
She's beautiful.
My mother died maybe 10 years ago, and after she died, I started going to Paris 3 or 4 times a year, just because I loved being around the language. It was a kind of mothering presence, and that's really how the book got made, was just through those very frequent visits and beginning to make notations. So I think Paris is the city of the beloved. Some say a man goes mad if he is without love. Je t'aime. It is said with such a childlike simplicity, the subject je and the object tu, making a little clump of letters to support the M and create a memorable sound package. Je t'aime. It seems to defy the need for further explanation. J'aime Baudelaire, whose father died on his 6th birthday, whose stepfather sent him away on a long voyage when he was 20, who lived for his writing and desired to derange conventions, who was the first poet to write melancholic conversational poems about the demons and perversions of his life, and yet whose art shines with an organic perfection of form. J'aime Rilke, though he found Paris oppressive. His poems speak in a low, calm voice. He says in his Book of Hours, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. J'aime James Lord, whom I last saw at the Hotel de Crillon, redone into a whorehouse, he complained. The corridors and shiny marble and gold, and with Rolls Royces and Jaguars with big hood ornaments waiting out front. Still, his friendship, like soup, meat, and wine, nurtured the poet of iron. Goodbye, sweetie, he said, his gift of friendship, not accompanied by any claim. J'aime the poet and translator Claire Malraux, an alchemist of language, whose translations transport, transfer, and transpose poetry from English into French, and find a balance between passion and reason, empathy and analysis, blur and precision. J'aime the kisses Parisians give one another, touching their cheeks and allowing men to do the same, though they never lock their arms in embrace. J'aime the dogs and cats in the neighborhood, as numerous as the children. Writing this now, I can hear a litter weeping for a bowl of milk. J'aime the silver splashing Seine River, shimmering against its banks in sunlight, and at night with street lamps that sparkle like diamonds on the murky water's surface. J'aime Parisians' strange obsession with their livers, drinking no cold beverages with ice and keeping the windows closed tight to avoid les courants d'air. J'aime the expression j'y vais lécher les vitrines, meaning literally to lick the windows while window shopping, and elle est à côté de ses pompes, meaning that she is next to her pumps when she is not feeling quite like herself. J'aime the sympathetic oysters, sea urchins, and crustaceans displayed on platters of ice outdoors on the avenues like vulnerable, paralyzed, edible artworks. J'aime the BBC affects that Parisians deploy when speaking English with heavy accents. I shall see you in a fortnight at Fontainebleau. J'aime the Église de la Madeleine because of Mary Magdalene, whose boat without sails is said to have landed like a migrant's at the mouth of the Rhone before she took refuge in a mountain forest cave. J'aime the Kiers with Octave. Octave is a figure in the book. black currant liqueur topped off with white burgundy at the Café Rostand, in winter sunlight overlooking the Luxembourg Garden. J'aime Aunt Julie, who lived through the Nazi occupation of Paris as a Jew and who never fully recovered from a broken heart after her brother died. We drank chicory together, and she was kind to me. J'aime the little wooden matchsticks, allumettes, with rose-colored combustive tips, which I light the gas stove with to make café au lait in the morning. J'aime the colonnades of gnarled trees at the Jardin des Plantes with their big scarred trunks and the red poppies scattered everywhere with bumblebees hugging their stamens. J'aime the handwritten brasserie menus, the cursive writing, less rigid and box-like than print, with a feminine flourish like a Peugeot. J'aime the electrician who speaks with a heavy Marseille accent like Uncle Gabriel, and who believes that Americans put ketchup on everything. J'aime the myriad shades of blue in the flower shops, of gray in the sulking sky, and the primary colors in the ubiquitous posies in the squares. J'aime the sweet cherries, cavaillon melons, morel mushrooms, and white asparagus at the marché. J'aime the fountains that make only a little sound when you walk by. J'aime how things change only slowly despite the endless groan of construction and refurbishing. J'aime the peace, beauty, and sense of calm that allow me to contemplate the lives of my maternal ancestors. J'aime the Buddhist monks and the Mormon missionaries, Aaron and Judd, who hope to convert me and, with deep blue eyes, almost did when we prayed on our knees together. J'aime Gabrielle, Michel, and Raphael, the lifeguards at the municipal pool, who tried to revive the swimmer who suffered a heart attack. Were they the archangels? I dove to the bottom and retrieved his goggles, drifting there. J'aime the railway cars spewing marvelous whiffs of steam at the Saint-Lazare station in the Impressionist paintings at the Musée d'Orsay, where color and light achieve an abstract vision. J'aime the decrepit elderly who inch down the avenues with two canes to prop them up, who impose on nobody and nothing but time. J'aime la closerie de Lilas, where poets once met regularly, eating poached haddock with spinach. I translated a quatrain that Octavio Paz wrote there, quote, to the most romantic corner in Paris where I left my heart and my illusion, between the glasses of red wine and quail breast, I leave this epigram full of affection. J'aime the red clay tennis courts of Roland Garros, where I watched my favorite player, powerful and restrained, past his prime, yet elegant, like a god in his twilight. J'aime the Napoleonic Civil Code, Title V, Chapter 6, on marriage and the respective rights and duties of married persons, updated to include gays and lesbians. And j'aime Octave, searching, affectionate, funny, still finding his place. For a time, I lived here, where the call of life is so strong. My soul was colored by it. Instead of worshiping a creator or man, I cared fully for myself and felt no guilt and confessed nothing. And in this place I wrote, I was nourished, and I grew.
And may
I have to thank him for switching things up at the last minute and asking me to read that, because I didn't want to read it, and actually I loved reading it. So thank you.
Well, this did not go how I planned, but I'm so glad.
You know,
There is a final image after what you just read. What is that? Who is that a picture of? These two people.
that's my grandfather,
Yeah.
and that's actually my older brother. Everyone will think it's me, but I used it because I only really met my grandfather once or twice, and I love the image. That's one of the stills from the video where they're walking down the street of Marseille. I must be about 2 years old in that picture, so.
And your grandfather, how to say his place at the end of the book?
Well, I don't know. Is it sentimental? My translator, Claire, didn't want me to put that picture there.
Really?
But because she thought it softened it. But I don't know. The book for me, we're living at a really coarse moment in American history, and I wanted the book to sort of be tender in a way that I feel our days are not too full of tenderness. So that's probably why the picture is there, is a final little note of tenderness.
I think tenderness was really effectively communicated.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to, in poems, when you're writing poems, you can write praise lyrics, but it's hard to, make a living just writing praise lyrics. You become a kind of, caricature of yourself very quickly. But it's a little, this is kind of like a love poem to Paris, I suppose. The book is so it represents a side of my personality that doesn't get much chance to be in the poems, I think, which is why I feel it's an important book for me.
I'm honored that this is how I got to know you.
Oh, well, good. Yeah, the poems are a real downer compared to the book. Yeah, that's for sure. They are. I have to say that. Though this book does have shadows through it.
Yes.
A lot of time is spent at Montparnasse, honoring the dead.
Thank you. I'm glad this did not go how I planned. I'd like to open it up to questions.
First off, I hope that was interesting. I have no idea what we were going to do and how to do it, but I'm happy to try and answer any questions.
We're coming around with a microphone. Coming your way. Coming your way because recording.
Yes.
I'm very interested in how you're juxtapositioning images with text.
Yeah. Do you have a copy there?
So anyways, you just made a statement about thinking about this last image and that perhaps it softened it. And I just wondered if you could talk more about those thoughts. How you thought this image interacted with the text and what it means to you that it softened.
Well, I think it was because of the words I grew that I wanted to show a little boy with his grandfather. I think that's really, it's that simple. That is my grandfather, but I was dandled on his knee when I was a tiny little boy. He died when he was in his early 40s.
Or maternal?
My mother's grandfather, my mother's father. In terms of other images,
What did you mean by it softens it?
oh, well, it's, all the pictures that are film stills, they all have something about their coloring and in their, these are in black and white, but the color versions, and they're all slightly out of focus, and they're all, they're vintage-like, and they exude nostalgia. And I think nostalgia, I guess I feel as a poet that nostalgia is something one must guard against constantly, I do feel that because I fear sentimentality, I suppose.
So there's a risk with that tenderness to
Yes.
become sentimental.
Yes, I think there always is. And there's nothing will kill a poem faster than sentimentality. I mean, I suppose there's a whole genre of fiction writing that is just sentimental. I mean, it's sort of romantic and, romantic sexual novels, of a certain sort. But I think that's what, I wanted there always to be, the great thing about those bee poems by Sylvia Plath that she wrote in a week at the end of her life is that they're very hard-edged. And I wanted this book to have a hard edge, but for that not to exclude tenderness as a presiding emotion in the book. And there's tenderness for Mr. Lord, there's tenderness for Claire, my translator, there's tenderness toward Octave. And it's kind of a reciprocal emotion because I feel I'm being entranced by Paris. You know, it's in that sense that I wanted to call the book Orphic Paris. It's just that Orphic is an entrancing power, the way Orpheus used his lyre to entrance. I feel Paris is a kind of entrancing force. So I allowed myself at the end of the book a kind of ecstatic gush of all this, the word love repeated. I've never used the word love so many times. In French, I mean, I used it. So it's not in English. But.
Henri, I want to ask, did you discover anything new about your family in going back and looking at these photos and reflecting? Was there anything surprising that you'd rediscovered about your past and your family?
Well, the films just fill me with awe for my parents.
Awe?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
awe in
that's-
what way?
Just that my parents had 5 children, they just had so little. I think that's what, it just fills me with awe for them.
What do you ecstatically hate about Paris?
Ecstatically hate. Oh, rudeness. Rude waiters. Oh.
They're tired of the tourists.
Rude waiters, yeah, that's hard to escape, that sort of tired of the tourist thing. I teased Claire, I gave her a no button. You know, you push the Claire, my translator. I tease her because I'm always saying to her, her favorite word is no. You know, so I gave her a button that you push it and it says no in 10, 15, 20 different ways. I hate the word no. You know, one of my favorite words in the English language is yes. So, no.
Question here in the back.
I'm sorry I'm at a disadvantage because I haven't seen your book and looked at the different chapters, but, pardon me? Yeah, I can buy it later. But you must have had so many impressions. How did you, as a writer or just as a subject approaching these different elements, how did you organize all your impressions? Because there must have been so many. Like, how did you separate them?
I wrote there's 17 parts, or 16?
17.
17. And I wrote them in parts, you know, I mean, you know, like one part in 6 months. So they were really, and I perfected that part. And then I have to say, it wasn't until I had written 5 or 6 parts that I began to see kind of what I was doing or what I wanted to do. They become more thematically focused as the book proceeds. I showed them all to Claire, my 92-year-old friend, and you know, she kind of went over. The book is coming out in French as well in the summer, and we wanted the book to not, you know, there's a whole kind of writing about France maybe that is suitable for Americans but not suitable for, but I wanted French people to like it as well. I mean, for it to be interesting to French people because it's really celebrating their culture and their history and their landscape. So there were certain things that she would cut out because of that factor. Like food, actually, there's almost no writing about food in the book. We agreed that I would not write about food because...
Did you want to write about food?
Well, there is one passage about food in the Réveillon sequence on the Christmas Eve, or Christmas dinner and New Year's Eve are these big, you know, epochal dinner nights. So one of them, I write about that. I
With your
think-
family.
Yes, with my French family. My French family is now all dead. The uncles that I met and knew are all dead like my parents. But in my 30s, I went to France for the first time and had these amazing meals with, you know, I got to know my Uncle Gabriel and my Uncle Mayus, who were very old country, you might say. So yeah, you know, as I proceeded, I realized I had to bring things in that were in the, you know, I had to keep the threads coming back at a certain pace. But I didn't know that when I was starting it, if that makes sense. I only realized that as I went along.
Proust writes about retroactive unity.
Retroactive unity?
Retroactive
Mhm.
unity. You
Yeah.
have a sense of there was some kind of...
That's what critics provide. You know,
Ah!
I feel, you know, I don't, you know, that when you're writing, you're in a sort of close focus mode. You're not in that sort of satellite mode of seeing everything globally. When I'm writing, I'm really in this. So it's very often hard to, you know, when I wrote them, I put asterisks. When I wrote I put asterisks between the episodes to provide breaks, but there are only spaces in the book. And that was an interesting editorial decision. They didn't want, you know, those kinds of breaks. And I think they made the right choice. I really am happy with the way it flows more. I think there's a little extra space.
To what degree were they written in order, the parts?
They were written in the order they appeared. And I wrote that last episode as the finish. You know, I feel like I could write another book, just the same idea, just the same thing about, you know, with 12 different themes, you know, doing the same thing, just with different subject matter. Well, like Proust's visit, I was telling him I'm embarrassed that, well, because he's a Proust scholar, that I have, you know, one of the things to do in Paris is to visit the Proust bedroom, and I've never done that in all these years. So here I am sitting with a Proust scholar, so I have nothing to say about that. Absolutely, you know. Yes.
I wanted to make one comment and then ask a question in
Yes.
relation to it. The comment is about the wonderful passage you read. I was constantly hearing echoes of Walt Whitman.
Yes.
And the reason, it's a piece of an anaphora, where every
Yes.
line begins with the same words. And then it sounds like free verse to me. So I kind of wondered if you had Whitman in mind when you were writing that.
I think whenever you write long lines, anaphora, just for those of you that aren't poetry people, anaphora is repetition at the beginning of the line. Epistrophe is at the end of the line. And I mean, the two things, you either think of Whitman or you think of the Old Testament. You know, those are the two things.
Well, he was thinking of that, certainly.
Yes, Whitman was, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and also because it is praise, you know, instead of praise of the earth, it's praise, this is praise of a setting. So yes, thank you. I mean, that's sort of like Proust and Sebald, that it's ridiculous for me to claim any relationship to these people.
And here's my follow-up. It's about
Yes.
the translation. One of the reasons that last passage works so beautifully is the transition from the French anaphora to the English. So in the translation, is the French changed to English?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't seen the translation. I guess it is. It must be, right? For it to work.
Yeah, I
No.
think so.
Oh, maybe it isn't. No, maybe it isn't. I actually don't know. I'll have to ask Claire that. I feel embarrassed that I didn't ask her that. There were tiny little edits that she did make for the French audience, but there was a point at which I just yielded to her and said, "I trust you." But that's a good question. That's a very. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in the book like that might apply in the same way.
Sure wouldn't work the same way if it were all in
Yeah.
the same language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it wouldn't. Yeah. It wouldn't. I am not bilingual. I speak French like a very intelligent 6-year-old. So another thing I'm chastised continually about. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to ask you about your origins as a poet. Who or what first turned you on to poetry?
Well, I grew up, my father was in the military, which is how he came to meet my mother after the war. And my father retired in Northern Virginia. So I went to college there, and there was a poet in residence there, and I just, took a class with him. And gosh, now 40 years have gone by. I can hardly believe it. I love the poet Elizabeth Bishop. When I was a young man, I loved the poet James Merrill. There are two poets in Boston, Louise Glick and Frank Bedard, who are sort of my favorite living American poets now. It's nice to see all these hands. Thank you.
The photographs that you've used as a poet, what do you think, even with Sebald, and I've always wondered this, does it enhance the poetry for the reader? Because you're using your own imagination while you're reading this. And then there's the photographs, which sort of, I haven't seen this book, I'm sure it's just absolutely great, but I don't, come to my mind.
In the next 10, 15 days, I'm giving a lot of readings. And in each case, I was asked if I wanted to show the images when I was reading, and I said no. So I guess bottom level, I want the writing to be able to exist without the pictures. But I think the pictures do add something, and I don't know that I can say exactly what, except maybe I think the way the book is written is that it sort of expands and contracts, sort of like breathing. And the pictures, I think, are part of that breathing process. They give a little, respite from the intent. The book is so highly descriptive, that it's not, and it's not like there's this exciting, sexy narrative, So, it's not this, there's not a lot of speed in the reading. It's intense reading, and I think the pictures were meant to just give some air, some breath space.
In your reading, it resonated a lot with my feelings about Paris too, and many people's feelings about Paris. And I'm just curious about your reflections on Paris as kind of a human invention. The Emperor Julian called it his beloved Lutetia. So it's been loved like we love it for 2,000 years. Why? Why there? Why that place? It kind of astounds me.
Yes. Well, I do feel I should add that one of the things that makes Paris special, in addition to its supreme beauty, you know, of the buildings, the river, the avenues, is the fact that the historical past is documented. I mean, I'm always amazed by the plaques that I come across that, you know, a young soldier was shot on this corner. A member of the resistance was, you know, held captive here. I mean, it's amazing, or that thousands of school children were shipped from this very school to, you know, the camps. I mean, that is part of the, that is part of what gives it an intensity to me. It isn't just about aesthetic beauty. It is this juxtaposition. You know, and I know it was for my mother, you know, when writing about Marseille. I don't know, do you want to say something about that?
About the,
What?
yeah, it's hard. America.
You can feel it in your feet,
And
even
for-
after
and for
walking
me,
10 miles.
I'd also say the Parisian sky.
The sky?
The sky, and the way the clouds are, and
The gray?
yeah. I mean, it's an excellent question, and Americans seem to be particularly smitten with Paris.
There is an extraordinary, I mean, for me, part of it is the language. That I've come to love the language, and I try and read as much as I can in French. And I know that's connected to the fact of my mother, you know, though my mother spent her whole life trying to be an American woman, you know, 50 years she spent trying to be an American woman. And then in the very last couple of years of her life, she completely regressed to the French language again. So that's part of my attachment, I'm sure, to the language anyway.
Any other questions?
How are we doing on time?
We're winding up.
Yeah.
Well, I think if there are no more questions, I think it's time to go back to the past, bring it to the present, taste the beauty, the tenderness, the extraordinary inspiration that Paris has to offer. So I invite you to come up and buy a book, Orphic Paris, and to meet Henri Cole and to talk with Professor Mark Calkins about Proust or anything else, bees, Orpheus, and join us for our next program. Merci et bonsoir.
Merci à vous.